Fantastic Four are Marvel's first family, but is their greatness relegated to a past age? Is the emphasis on family something that can't work in the superhero comics of a cynical, godless age? Jonathan Hickman didn't think so, and he set out to write a series of Fantastic Four comics that revitalized the team by leaning into its family dynamic. Today on Truth, Beauty, Comics.
Welcome to Truth, Beauty, Comics. I'm Levi, a cartoonist.
And I'm Felix, a guy who likes comics.
And this is the podcast where we look for transcendence in a pulpy medium. And today we'll be talking about the first 5 issues of Fantastic Four by Jonathan Hickman. And Felix, this was your suggestion. I'd never read these before. Yeah, maybe tell us a little bit why you want to go through these today.
Yeah, so I thought we'd been spending some time looking at Silver Age Fantastic Four, which I really enjoy. I love Silver Age comics. And I thought this would be a nice, because we mostly read older stuff, but we often have sort of references to newer things, sometimes in the form of compliments, more often in the form of criticisms. And I thought that looking at the opening of this run of Fantastic Four by Jonathan Hickman that started in 2009, that ultimately sort of led through his Avengers and New Avengers up to the 2015 Secret Wars that supposedly is going to be most of the basis for the upcoming, $1.5 billion movie from Marvel Studios. I thought it would be interesting to discuss this because it's a run that I like a lot. I think it has a lot going for it, but it also sort of, having come directly from the Silver Age stuff, is a useful one to look at and sort of say, all right, what are some of the problems that we see in contemporary American superhero comic storytelling? And I thought this would be a useful one to look at because it's not just one where we're just going to have criticisms, or at least I'm not just going to have criticisms, because I think that this story has a lot of heart. I think that Hickman gets the family dynamic that makes the Fantastic Four special, and I think he centers Reed and Reed's sonship and fatherhood in really interesting ways over the course of the whole series. And, we're not reading the whole series. We read first 5 issues, and we'll likely only actually talk about the first 3 realistically, because there's just a lot going on. And so I thought, and I also think there are some interesting questions raised here about the primacy of the sort of so-called greater good, and the relationship between the health of the family and the sort of supposed health of the whole. And I think it ultimately comes down on something I find interesting, and this is something we'll probably dig into a bit more later, is that in much public moral conversation, we think of ethics primarily in terms of 2 things, like self-fulfillment in a radically autonomous, selfish way. Sort of, I can get married and get divorced a million times and leave kids around because I'm really in love with this next person or whatever. Pick your example. So the sort of radical self-fulfillment model, or if we're being sort of reflective and self-abnegating and valuing sacrifice, a purely utilitarian model that sort of tries to say, okay, what's the best thing for the whole? If we take my own selfish things, you can have a kind of Rawlsian form of it in like the veil of ignorance or whatever, but it's sort of greater good. What's the greatest good we can achieve, right? And something that's often triumphed by sort of scientific types, not necessarily actual scientists, but sort of people who think only in terms of contemporary science, often champion this kind of utilitarian approach. And so I think that these issues show the appeal of that and show the sort of power of that in ways that are really interesting, but ultimately rejects that for more sort of virtue ethics account. That, while not saying let's just forget about the good of people far away from us or anything, but to say we actually have prior obligations that we need to be fulfilling, primarily sort of in our own family, and that it's only by working out, sort of starting with what's closest and working out, that we can actually achieve that good in sort of real sustainable ways. And I think that's interesting on its own terms, but it's also sort of interesting like sociologically, because I think most of the time, even though people would explicitly give some combination of this kind of like self-actualization account and utilitarian account, the stories that they want to read and want to see on TV and in movies actually have a kind of virtue ethics account, an account that's more in line with older sort of Christian ideas of human flourishing, and that's more in line with the sort of older idea of the common good rather than the kind of utilitarian idea of the greater good. And so I just think that that's really interesting. I think that works really well with Reed's character specifically. So anyway, so that's a bunch of stuff. But those are sort of a bunch of reasons I thought it would be interesting to kind of look at this. This was your first time coming to this. So kind of what did you think, and are there any is my long monologue spur anything?
No, I think I definitely I appreciated the 3 issues we're kind of looking at. Because of that, there was something a little bit more to latch onto, and you can see that kind of throughout all these. This is the tension that that Hickman's driving at in these books. I just think from there's interesting themes here, and this one out of I have not read the whole kind of omnibus of Hickman's work, but I've read quite a bit of it. I think these issues do the best at exploring that. The challenge, I think, for me as a reader coming into it is just the problem with modern comics in general, right? And even these issues, there's so many points I'm going like, what's going on? Like who are these people? What are the stakes here? It's much less with this one, I'd say, than the first 5 issues, where there's all this. They're referencing things that have happened but they don't explain what happened. It seems like they have consequences, but I'm not sure what consequences they have. I don't know. I'm familiar with some of these characters who are showing up, but I'm not sure why they're behaving the ways they are or taking the actions they do. And even in this one, there's some of that, I'd say, as it goes on, where I'm like, well, who are these guys and why are they behaving in certain ways? Yeah, it also kind of, I think, follows a pattern that we talked about this, I think, last episode with Galactus, where we kind of said we kind of prefer the Marvel world where it's the New York streets and those are the stakes of things that can kind of happen in a more working class world. And this is so far beyond that. And this, I just think, is a problem with modern comics. They often elevate the stakes to like such ridiculously high levels. So we're not even talking about the fate of the universe here anymore. We're talking about the fate of infinite universes and stuff. And it's all kind of like secondary stakes to some degree, so there's not just one infinity gauntlet. There's multiple infinity gauntlets that are floating around now. So maybe we can talk a little bit about just the whole concept of the multiverse that is so prevalent in storytelling, especially comics, when trying to maintain continuity and also tell new stories. But yeah, so I think there's a good there's good themes here that I appreciated reading this, but I felt like the packaging often left something to be desired for me, I guess would be the way I'd
and
put
one
it.
thing I should clarify for readers. So for anyone who's listened to this podcast before, I am something of a ranter against the prevalence of what are called event comic books in contemporary superhero comics. So with Marvel, about twice a year, all the comic books, all of the like 40 or 50 or 60 monthly comic book titles get interrupted in order to have a sort of huge event. And I mean, okay, not all of them always do, but it happens really often. And this sort of, if you're buying every single book that comes out from Marvel and spending, $400 a month, $500 a month on these, then it's fine. If you aren't, and if you just like certain series and you want to read them the way that sort of comics were for, from the 50s, 60s, 70s into the 80s, you're kind of just out of luck. Now, this run of Fantastic Four doesn't get interrupted by an event at any point during it. But inexplicably, it starts with a book during an event called Dark Reign, where the Green Goblin takes over the Avengers or something. I don't remember. And so the Fantastic Four are defending the Baxter Building against, something to do with Norman Osborn or whatever. And it's 4 or 5 issues of this, and it's some of the least interesting stuff that Jonathan Hickman has ever written. My guess is that's because he probably had planned out a lot of his stories, and they said, hey, actually, you're going to be starting with this Dark Reign tie-in. And then he probably scrambled to write something, and then they put it together. And then that's at the beginning of all the sort of Jonathan Hickman Fantastic Four omnibuses and complete collection. And so you have Hickman recommended to you, and then you start out with this sort of continuity heavy, not very interesting story that has almost nothing to do with the whole rest of his run. The only thing in the whole thing is that it introduces a machine that gets reintroduced anyway, so you don't need to have read it at all, but it's at the front of it. So if you buy the Jonathan Hickman Fantastic Four complete collection, just skip the Dark Reign issues at the beginning and just get started with issue number 1, or just go for the trade paperbacks and just start with 1. It's a really annoying thing. There's also another slight annoyance with the numbering that we'll get into, but that doesn't really matter at this point. Well, and then in terms of,
for context, I read the wrong 3 issues in prep for this episode too, just because of confusion with issue numbering.
I was looking because I had started the podcast notes, and then Levi had filled a bunch out, and then I came back and said, wait, this is the wrong stuff. So then we ended up starting late, and because of our miscommunication. So that sort of thing can happen. Yeah. Anyway, so if we seem less prepared today, that's why. But in any case, so yeah, I think Hickman's run on Fantastic Four is a bit of a best of times, worst of times. I think it shows many of the pitfalls of contemporary American superhero comics while simultaneously telling some stories that are really good and are not something that could happen in a Silver Age book. That are actually things that feel very much in continuity with them, and continuity makes it sound like it's sort of about details. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that it's the same kind of emotional storytelling, but actually better than some of the Silver Age stuff. But at the same time, it's sort of so it sort of has the good and the bad of contemporary superhero comics.
Yeah, indeed. Before we get into the plot,
go ahead.
Can we talk just a little bit about the art on this?
Yeah,
because I think this is the thing that jumped out at me the most.
One of the bad things.
And it's not particularly bad as far as, it's not like this is Marvel's worst stuff, but it really, what it really reminds me of is the difference between the visuals of the prequel trilogy versus the original Star Wars trilogy, right? Where the constraints were working to make actually far better artistic output in one case. And then once those constraints were removed, things just got muddy and visibly worse. Obviously, Jack Kirby is one of probably the 10 greatest comic artists who's ever lived. So, this, we can't say that this needs to be issued by Jack Kirby, but Marvel, they had principles that worked very well for a long period of time, even when Jack Kirby was not drawing. I think How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way is a classic book of how to draw comics. And they did it.
If any issue of any Silver Age Marvel or DC book, even if it's by a no-name writer, by a no-name illustrator, it's really clear what's happening, and the characters are clearly defined. Characters are generally on model. You know who every character is, right? Whereas over the course of this. I mean, I think the artist who starts out, I think it's Eagleman, is fine. Nothing special, but fine. But like, there are artists over the course of it where sometimes I'll see a character and I will literally not know who it is. Like,
Yeah.
like Johnny Storm at the beginning. Like, some artists draw him like Johnny Storm, like a sort of cocky 20-year-old or whatever. And sometimes he just looks like a weird middle-aged dude.
Yeah.
Like, it's
Right.
like there's just right, because this is one of the problems with contemporary superhero art, at least on Marvel's end, is that every 2, 3, 5 issues they're changing artists, and they're not artists who all work in a house style, right? Because if
Hmm.
it's 1968 and you're changing from Jack Kirby to Don Heck trying to look like Jack Kirby, unless you're paying attention, you're not going to notice. And even if you are noticing, you know who every character is, and they still
Hmm.
look the same. So that, like,
Yeah,
you are
there's I think it's
420.
for me the major issue is just this addition of digital color. Then it seems like really I don't think comics has really recovered from, to be honest. Like, and this is like going on 30 years now, where it's if you compare the work of Kirby, like color is working so much better with the inks, where you have the blacks and the whites are so important for the page, where they're setting kind of the min and max values. And then color is much more of a compositional element, where it's like it's showing you where the heroes are on the page, where the villains are on the page, where the background and then the foreground and maybe some other elements are, right? So it's compositional. It's not really striving for realism. And the pages read so much better. They're much clearer just to look at. Like the first page you open up in this, I'm just like, what am I looking at? There's all these conflicting colors. It's just a mess, really. The art, and there's everything has a highlight. There's like a million highlights happening. There's a million gradients, and this is just it's
Sorry,
not the
what's a
worst
highlight?
digital coloring. What's that?
Sorry, what?
Oh, yeah. So a highlight is I could try to hold this up, but instead of this is not something that really shows up a lot in the original stuff, but like I'll hold this up here. So if you look at the Thing, right, the Thing, can we get this? All right, the Thing is not a solid color, but he has these kind of like lights
Yeah,
showing
yeah,
like
yeah.
all over his body. Same with Johnny Storm. There's like a million different
Colors and
variants
tones.
here. So it just all kinds of turns into so if you look at like the Galactus trilogy or something like that, it's immediately kind of clear where everyone is and who's going on. But you can look at these pictures and go, oh wow, there's Reed. I was looking at this for like a minute and I didn't even notice him there, because he's so buried in all these other colors that it just turns into kind of a soup, really. And
Yeah.
it's gotten better. It was really bad when digital coloring first became a thing and kind of more sophisticated printing, but it's still not good. Like it's rare that I pick up a comic and I find like people actually know how to use color in a way that's superior to spot coloring. Like,
Well, and it's strange too, because this is above my pay grade, but as I understand it, coloring similar to digital coloring was around in European comics for a couple decades before it came to America,
mm-hmm.
and it was used completely differently, and it was used, like, frankly, well. Like, it looked good.
Mm-hmm.
It looked actually in a lot of ways superior to the old four color dot style. But then when America gets it for superhero comics, like, I couldn't articulate it as well as you just did, but it looks like it's sort of you're spending a massive amount of time trying to figure out like where the light is coming from, but you're not spending any time thinking what are people's eyes being drawn to,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
Because a well constructed page, like I think about like one of my favorite mangas, Bleach. In the early volumes, one of the things that people most commented on about the art is the way that it was a great first manga for people, because even though you're not used to reading in the opposite direction, just the art has emotion to it. And particularly the fight scenes, you can see, okay, this character's doing this character's doing this, and you can follow everything that's happening at every point, right? Whereas this, like, the action scenes are not dynamic, and as a general rule, and the sort of people standing around talking scenes just look like people standing around talking. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
like neither of
It,
them are done in a way that draws your attention and kind of wows you artistically.
Right. And I think, you have to be somewhat util, but like if you, in our notes here, if you scroll down, there's two panels that I think are interesting to look at. One that's from this, they're almost identical compositions, one from the Galactus trilogy by Jack Kirby and one from this Hickman run, where it's Sue Storm in the background. In one, Franklin's in the foreground and the other Reed's in the foreground. And she's vaguely um, if you notice how much more information is being presented in the Hickman version, where there's all the color is like putting all these different shadows everywhere. Everything kind of has its own shadow and contour. There's light, but then it's at the same time, like the background is the same kind of color as the flesh tones. So everything kind of blends in together. There's nothing stark happening. There's just a lot of information being presented, much of which is not really relevant. And then the coloring choices they're making make it just kind of overall more muddy. It's more monochrome. Whereas if you look at the Kirby, they've chosen to go with a very abstract, just red background. Like this would not be real. It's something that's just making it cleaner to distinguish the characters when you're reading, right? So this is a choice.
Some generic buildings in the background that aren't focused on is the most you get. Other than that, it's just color.
Yeah. And this one, it reads much better because there's a very clear differentiation between the background and the foreground, and the characters that it draws your eye much better. And and there's just less information, so you can focus on the important parts, which is, Sue is mad. She has an angry expression, right? It's just easy. It's a better use of like just the details on a page, and it more clearly communicates who it is visually and what the emotions are in that moment. So yeah, there's just it's just a subtle example, but I think there's the options they're not being used well, and this is just kind of it's too much information to process, and so your brain just kind of skips over it. It's distancing rather than engaging.
I see. Okay, sorry. I was looking at the wrong. There are two different sort of sets of comparisons. I realized the ones you were talking about where it's the single panel. I had been just looking at the whole pages you had just above. For anybody who wants to see them, there are pictures on our Patreon, which anybody can access. You don't have to give money for to see that. And it is crazy. Like it's zoomed out, so I can't really read the words, but I can tell what's going on really clearly. Whereas like in the huge twofold spread, there's basically one part where I say, oh, okay, Mr. Fantastic is getting tied up there. Other than that, I can't tell you anything that's happening. There is this sort of, and I mean, right, like you could say it's a simplicity in a negative way, but like it's also comprehensible, and it's also sort of attractive. Like it's a lot nicer to look at, I think.
Yeah, I think the whole point of color is part of like storytelling, right? It's an asset that you have, and it can be used really well. It's not like you can only use spot color to do comics, but and there are some artists who do that, but they use it to clarify the compositions, and then communicate other things. And it just seems like the house style for Marvel, it's just there's not a lot of thought that goes into it, and it's just like slathering on textures and detail without thinking about the overall compositions or how they work together. The last thing I'm going to point out then we should get into the story, but Marvel seems to have embraced this method of just having panels overlap each other, which I think just makes it even more confusing. And I'm not sure why they do this. It doesn't seem to have a lot of rhyme or reason, but comparing it to where you have the gutters clearly separating kind of moment from moment in comics, here they're just overlapping kind of randomly. They still have gutters, but it feels very, I don't know. It just doesn't seem to add anything. It just kind of confuses each page and doesn't improve the legibility.
It's funny, right? Because if we think back to when, a few episodes back when we were reading Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, like the way that you use the space between panels is crucial. And there are times when a cartoonist doesn't want to have panels, right? But it should be a conscious choice, right? There's a reason that you're constructing a page like this. Whereas there is this kind of, so many things on the artistic side of contemporary Marvel seem to just be sort of done by default. Like there's simultaneously there's two seemingly contradictory things of this are both the case. One, they're constantly rotating artists, and the artists have radically different styles. And two, despite all these different styles, there are a bunch of things that should be conscious choices on the artist and colorist part that seem to just always default to one thing, and not even right. It's not even necessarily a bad thing, right? It's not that there's a problem with ever using digital color in a way that's like really attentive to where the light is coming from, right? And it's not that there's a problem with panels bleeding into each other, but a work of art should do each thing it does for a reason, right? Like there should be artistic unity, and I think with even some of the better contemporary artists at Marvel, there are a lot of things that are just done because that's just how they do them. And so it's funny, right? Because in the 60s, comics were thought much more as a low price, kiddie, pulpy thing than they are now. Whereas now they're thought of as like a high price thing that takes a ton of work to make happen. I actually think the old stuff had a lot more sort of conscious artistic decisions made for storytelling purposes than certainly many of the comics coming out today.
Agreed. Yeah. Well, should we dive into the plot here?
Sure, yeah. So I really like the opening of this first issue. There's this 2-page scene that it opens with. It's a flashback. It says, pull it up. It says then, and then a couple pages later it says now. The flashback focuses on Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, as a little boy playing with his father. Reed's dad encourages him to jump from this tall structure, saying that he'll catch the boy. Reed is really nervous and says he wants to do something else. His father tells him that though it's totally okay to be afraid or to fail, not trying is just unacceptable. And the boy then says he's ready and, he's going to do his best, and he jumps. I really like this opening 2 pages. It's a striking opening, I think, in part because of the way that this serves as kind of setting the table
framing
thematically,
device,
as well as introducing us to 2 characters who are going to be really important, and introducing us to why the central character of this series is the way that he is. Right. So there's this. I think it's useful as we start to look at this one quotation. So Hickman's run here was quite popular and sold very well, and is now somewhat influential. When he finished the run in the last sort of collected edition, at the end of it, he had a little note where he was talking about his time on Fantastic Four and what he was going to miss and this sort of thing. He tells the story of once when he was being interviewed, he was asked what he did to make the Fantastic Four, quote unquote, relevant again. And he said that his answer at the time was not actually particularly helpful. It was sort of about like, paying attention to this and that, and working really hard and thinking a lot about it, and just if it wasn't really actually getting to the core of it. And he says, after having been given this time to talk, he says, this is a quotation: "The world sucks. I'm not saying this as an anachronist or idealist, but one of the reasons for this condition is that the expectation that family is a thing of permanence is dying, which is actually what makes the Fantastic Four so interesting. They exist in opposition to that. They are a perfect family in an imperfect world, and they represent the hope of what could be. The franchise became relevant again because we tapped into this in a way that resonated, and even more importantly, the driving force behind it was something we could all understand." And skipping a bit, it was love. Boundless, unconditional, to the end of time and back, lift you up from death itself. Love. And what's not fantastic about that? I think often throughout the Fantastic Four's history, since, let's say the 70s, 80s, writers have been sort of embarrassed about the Fantastic Four. They've sort of felt like it's this old style comic books that's not very exciting and based around this kind of old-timey, quaint idea of family that's not really relevant anymore. Hickman consistently leans into this in ways that make for really good storytelling, and also like challenge readers in various ways. And so I really like that this sort of starts out with this kind of influential memory, right? Because we don't get into this in these issues, but it sort of comes out in time that like Reed's father abandoned him and his mother in order to go do sort of exciting scientific superhero-esque stuff out in the multiverse. Right, and so this guidance here, right, like is simultaneously sort of good advice, right? That like it's okay that we get scared about things, it's okay to try and fail, but if something matters, you need to try. But it's also like in certain circumstances really dangerous and harmful, right? If it's sort of taken, particularly in this more like kind of utilitarian way, that for a few issues Reed does take it. This is we're gonna be talking about. That like we actually do need to have limits on our trying. There are things that should be constraining us, right? I've never seen Jurassic Park, but I'm given to understand that there's a line about this of sort of they're so focused on figuring out how they could that they never stop to think if they should or something to that effect.
Oh, wow, I'm surprised you've never seen Jurassic
Yeah.
Park. That's quite the
No,
revelation.
it's one that I've meant to for forever, but I've just never gotten around to it. I know
Yeah,
it's
I
sort of
think.
iconic.
Yeah.
But yeah,
No, I mean, I think this you're right. I think it's a good. I mean, it's almost. I'd say that framing device also plays nicely into the present day framing device, where they're basically fighting what's a kind of an evil father in this scientist. So the team is fighting this scientist. What is he? Some kind of wizard. He calls himself like the
yeah,
scientific wizard.
yeah,
And he
because there are
makes clones of
several
himself. Yeah. No, I was just going to say, yeah, he this wizard to power his robots that he's using to fight the Fantastic Four makes essentially sons, clones of himself that he belittles and abuses, and so it's a contrast between kind of the and it nicely, I think, tees up the rest of the events too, of like a powerful father maybe figure, right? How does that affect the children, and what does that mean? And here's someone who is clearly at the expense of their clones, but children is kind of how they're framed here.
Yeah.
Is pursuing grandiose ends and what he thinks is his destiny or mission or whatever at the expense of the children. So it's a nice framing, I think, and a nice contrast, and will tee up, foreshadow what the choices Reed is making.
Yeah, and it's interesting too with that when they jump forward, we don't initially know that it's the wizard, and they don't initially know that it's a wizard. They're just fighting these sort of giant robots that are designed there's one designed to go against each member of the team, right? To sort of counter their strengths and prey on their weaknesses, right? And so what does this family do? They say, okay, let's all switch. Right? They say, okay, I'm going to, like, I forget what it is, but it's sort of, like Ben's going to attack the one that's going against Mr. Fantastic, and Sue's going to take the one that's going against Ben, and yada, yada. Right? And I think that is sort of part of what families do, right? Like you do play to each other's strengths and you lean on each other. And I really like that. And and there's this one clone that we sort of meet here. Who's a small boy who's the wizard sort of seems to habitually just like insult and belittle. But Mr. Fantastic apprehends the wizard and he's going to jail. And so later we see Reed putting his two children, Franklin and Valeria, to bed. He's told them the story of what happened that day. First he puts Valeria to bed, and then he goes to say goodnight to Franklin. And when they're alone, Franklin asks what's going to happen to the little boy. Reed says the authorities will find a new home for him, but that children with bad parents usually have a very difficult time of life. Franklin says that, he expects Reed is going to help the little boy. Quote, you have to try. And Franklin then falls asleep. And you can kind of see this weighing on Reed's mind as as he sort of comes back to the family, and Johnny and Ben are doing Johnny and Ben things, talking about a vacation, and Reed sort of hugs Sue, but is just clearly has his mind on other things. And we sort of begin to get a bit of a sense of some of the things that are gonna be going on with Sue over the course of this arc, or rather this run by Hickman, where she's just sort of clearly experiencing some self-doubt over parenthood and life and things, and that's going to sort of continue throughout. But in any case, Reed sort of says he needs a bit of time by himself and goes into his private lab. There he sort of begins reflecting on this machine, and this again is the one thing that comes from that annoying Dark Reign tie-in series that starts a lot of the books that you can just skip, is that the machine happened. But in any case, he had judged the machine to be sort of too dangerous, so he left it in this kind of unused room where he has 100 ideas he had to change the world, and then 100 first that was even crazier. Something he says that was a greater one beyond that. Idea number 101, solve everything. So he enters the machine, which serves as a portal, where he encounters these 3 strange figures.
This is Reed's Plan 9 from outer space.
And he asks them how to solve everything. And they say aggressively, and we realize these are Reeds from alternative universes. They introduce themselves, they start talking, and then it becomes clear that there are lots of them. They come in, and there's this sort of huge page with just dozens of Reeds from different universes, many of whom have radically different power sets. One of them looks like he has the powers that Johnny Storm has in the main Marvel universe. One of them looks like a Nova Corps member. One of them looks like Professor X. One of them seems to be psychic. One looks like the Silver Surfer, etc., etc. And they basically introduce that it's this council of Reeds, and that it's a place for them to reach their full potential. So that's the opening issue.
Yeah, in the multiverse, every one of us has a council somewhere that is trying to help us all, trying to reach our full potential.
Yeah, I do tend to. I find multiversal storytelling very tiring. I even found it tiring before it became extraordinarily trendy. I think the kind of basis in both physics and philosophy for postulating a multiverse is very weak, and in part motivated by a desire to avoid tendencies in like Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics that are very open to like traditional Christian ideas of the universe. But even apart from that, I think that dramatically speaking, the multiverse often serves to lessen the dramatic impact of things. However, occasionally it's done well, and I like it. And in this case, I like it, and we'll get in a bit more as to why in the next couple of issues. But as a setup, how did you find this? How did you sort of find the idea of the Council of Reeds? Was this intriguing at all, or was it just sort of another multiverse thing?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I have fairly big problems with the multiverse as well. Ideas, and whenever it kind of shows up, and this is one of those things. It's ironically like so overused in comics, and I think people might think it's a more recent innovation, but it's been like going on since the 60s, with like Superman, and so this might have been more compelling if it hadn't been something I'd been reading since like forever. But I can't think of the last time, Superman like, hi, Superman, I'm Superman from Earth 2. And it's just like, it happens all the time to some degree. And so whenever it does show up, I can't think of the last time I've read something that I found compelling. Because typically what it seems to do for me is actually lower the stakes, because in absolutely. A multiversal setting, like you can kill off anyone you want because there's infinite Reeds. So, Reed can die, and Reed will, Reed, quote unquote, will die numerous times. We'll see various members of this council. I'm not a fan, I'd say, but
Yeah, I think
this might not be the
one thing
worst
that I
version of
find,
this. I actually thought the last one was the setup to this with the multiverse jumping around into all these different multiverses is really
oh yeah,
tiresome.
that one is no, that one is just, yeah. Again, I tell everybody to skip the Dark Reign stuff. With Fantastic Four, I think it's pretty clear that Hickman had to throw that together quickly and just told the story, and then like yeah, that it was not. I don't think it was part of his plan initially. Uh, yeah, and I also think one of the sort of deeply problematic aspects. We'll get back to the story soon, I promise. One of the deeply problematic aspects for storytelling of using the multiverse is this. For, I won't say all, but most stories with any sense of sort of virtue or heroism presume that we should work hard to choose what is good over what is evil, what is good over what is expedient, even when it is difficult. But according to fairly standard notions of the multiverse,
Storytelling. Yeah.
I won't say in all, but certainly most stories that have any real sense of virtue and heroism, implicit within them is the idea that when faced with difficult decisions where it would be easier to do something that was wrong and maybe expedient, between the two choices, we should make that difficult but good choice, right? But as most sci-fi explanations of the multiverse claim, every time it's an oversimplification of multiversal theory, I realize, but this is the way that it's often talked about. Implicit within it, or rather explicit within it, is the idea that every time you make a choice, you make another universe. And so there's another universe where you chose to do the bad thing. And so ultimately, character virtue development is a mirage, and we just happen to be reading the story in the universe where he makes the good decision, but you could be telling the exact same story where he makes the wrong decision, right? And so I actually think like multiversal storytelling, like an even deeper problem to me. I completely agree with the problem of sort of lowering stakes. Even deeper than that, it's just kind of calls into question the very idea that like growth is possible and that free will is real in a meaningful sense.
It's like I was in my notes, I was like, it's like secular Calvinism, basically. It's
Yeah.
it's like everything is preordained, not even by a benevolent God, but just because of infinite probabilities, So it's like, and so, it undermines the whole idea of like a hero, a virtuous hero who chooses the good over the evil, because just by choosing the good, he chooses the evil in another probability universe. I mean, so there's really, it's just nihilistic ultimately to me, and I find it very, very off-putting.
But if we sort of set it aside, I think there's a benign way of using multiversal storytelling that Marvel often fails to do. But it is this. Not there are infinite universes, but there are a bunch of universes. And they're different. And like, in effect, they're like different galaxies that are really big and just hard to get between. And, there are, like, I think, apart from other sort of philosophical problems I have with Doctor Who at times, I think that when Doctor Who has done multiversal stuff, as they do, every 15 seasons or so, like they don't do it very often, which I think is part of why they do it well, or at least passably. It's more like that. It's more like, here's this country that's across a big sea and we don't have a boat, basically. I think that kind of multiversal storytelling works because there's not a notion that these are infinite, and there's not even necessarily a notion that they're sort of determined. It's more like things are bigger and weirder than you realized. And I think that can be fun. I think this story teeters between them. It doesn't really, so far as I can remember, ever kind of make explicit claims about the like creation of new universes, and things about choices, um, which I think makes it like more tolerable to me. um,
Yeah.
but more importantly, for dramatic purposes, it focuses on a single reed, and it says this reed is our protagonist, and all these other reeds are very similar to him, but are further down a path he's beginning to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also he's in love with his Sue, and he loves his Franklin and Valeria, and he's on a
Right.
team with his Sue and his Ben and his Johnny, and he loves his Earth. Right? There is still a kind of focus on the single figure, right? And like sometimes in multiversal storytelling, there's just this sort of like, oh, your wife died. Well, here's a one who's just like her from another universe. Hooray. Um, and I find that, like, as someone who's married, very distasteful because I don't want a different wife,
Right.
even if she has the same name and looks the same. And as someone who like reads and is invested in characters, I find that very distasteful.
Yeah.
I think this avoids those temptations. So I think that's part of why it works, is that like the other reads are not stand-ins for Reed. They're instead like characters in their own right, particularly as we sort of go down the line later in the series where we can read. They're characters in their own right, and they're kind of warnings to him, as we'll see in the next couple of issues.
Yeah, well, let's continue on then. So, I mean, the story continues with Reed introduced to this council of Reeds, and they're doing these things, seemingly benevolent things. So they face off Galactus on a different universe is Galactus, and saving Earth there, and they are feeding another whole universe by
this
off a
part
planet.
is actually worth pausing on for a moment, right? Like so one of the reads is showing our read how there's this planet that wasn't super useful and didn't have anyone living on, and he terraformed it and uses it to grow crops to send to planets that are
starving.
Yeah. And he sort of says, I made this. I made this sort of 25-mile square patch of land and called it the farm and did this. And Reed says, like, oh, this is good. And he says, look, you're not understanding. The 25 miles was like my first test. There are whole planets and indeed several whole universes that are dedicated entirely to this farming. Why would I stop at one? And he says, now take a look out at the edge of the field. Now pretend there's no horizon.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so we're given this example of like something that's really good, obviously, like feeding the hungry and the way that they're able to do that. And then we're showing something else. You can go ahead and keep something.
Yeah, so we cut to a different scene where they're defeating a Dr. Doom, who's a perennial antagonist for the Fantastic Four, obviously from early times. So this is a different Reed defeating Dr. Doom, and he effectively lobotomizes him at the end of this, and takes him beneath the council chamber of the Reeds, and there's what seems like dozens, if not hundreds, of Dooms, all lobotomized beneath this chamber. So this is kind of the dark side of what they're doing, and Reed feels this is wrong, but the other Reed assures him that this is necessary. So yeah, so somewhat tough love for the Doom character.
And interestingly too, the other Reed asks explicitly, like, "Hey, you've been shown the farm, right? Before he showed, you've seen what good we're doing,
because you're not going to like this side of it, basically."
And as this story is going on, at a couple points, sort of are shown Reed at home, and there's this clear kind of like, it's clear that he's not really there, and it's causing tension between him and Sue. Sue is sort of saying, like, you're spending a lot of time by yourself, which she thinks is true in one way, but is actually true in quite another way.
Yeah. You're spending a lot of
And then
time
there's
with
this,
yourselves.
yeah. And there's this really striking page when it goes back, it shows Sue and Reed asleep at 3:39 in the morning. Or rather, Sue is asleep and Reed is just lying there awake. And he looks over at her and then it just zooms out and he's gone. I love that series of images.
Yeah, there's some nice, honestly, I do. I know we kind of dogged on the art early on. I think there's some nice storytelling choices that the artist makes here. I think more so in the choice of how to frame some of these scenes that I appreciate more than actually the technical details or the execution. But I do think, yeah, there's this is better than some of the art that's in here, and it does make for some good moments. He makes some good choices, I think.
Yeah.
We also see as a kind of another scene flashback with his dad, who seems to be, encouraging him to live up to his potential, telling him that there's something special in you. You are different. Reed is feeling kind of down because he recognizes that he's different from the kids at his school, but he tells him, "Hey, you are different. You have potential. There's nothing you can't do. I want you to live up to that." Essentially, is the advice his father's giving him, and that seems to lead into what be one of the driving forces behind Reed and wanting to be a part of this council is the potential that it can do, that he has to live up to.
Yeah. And then we have the big cliffhanger of the issue, which the council of Reeds are hanging out working, and suddenly Reed comes and says, "I'm so sorry they made me," and who should slam through a portal but the Celestials.
People I've vaguely heard of, but I don't know what their deal is.
I didn't see.
Right.
But just like massively all you need to know is they're massively powerful, weird things made up by Jack Kirby in the 80s. But or no, wait, was it? Yeah, right. The Celestials come from his like weird meter stuff.
They
right?
look Kirby-ish. It would not surprise me if these were his creations. Yeah.
But in any case, there's the third issue. There's a massive, sort of horrifying, violent fight where a bunch of alternate universe Reeds die. It's been established in an earlier issue that the sort of three, I think it's just the three sort of head Reeds, all captured the Infinity Gauntlets in their respective universes. The Infinity Gauntlet is, well, everybody's seen Infinity War and Endgame, so you probably know. But for those who don't, it's this Marvel's great MacGuffin that sort of gives you power over everything, basically. But as has long been established, they only work in their own universes, and they're powerless outside of them. So one of the Reeds that has an Infinity Gauntlet goes to a Reed who very conveniently has the power of opening portals to other universes in his chest. He opens a portal to the one Reed's universe. That Reed sticks his hand in and uses the Infinity Gauntlet to help them sort of get away from the Celestials. Everyone escapes to their own universes to try and find weapons to sort of respond. We then sort of jump to a Franklin and Valeria story. If we were reading more, we would talk about, but really is just very short and doesn't matter for this story. So we'll jump by. And then there's this really striking scene where Reed is piling sort of weapon upon weapon to bring back to fight the Celestials. And there's some dialogue from Sue on the other side of the door. She really touchingly sort of comes and like apologizes for the way that she said something earlier. And says, this is just one of those things you need to work through on your own. I know it must be very important. And she says, like, I miss you so much right now, but you take however long you need, because what I want is for you to be you, and what I expect is for you to do what you think is right. I'll be here waiting when you're done. I find that really striking. And then, we jump back to the universe. There's this huge splash page with the Celestials where the coloring and lighting, I think, is slightly better than some of the earlier ones, but it's still a bit soupy. And they're finally able to sort of get a temporary defeat against the Celestials. However, go ahead.
I think I was just going to say that I think this was what the one Reed then reveals to them after the fight is over is that, the choice that all of these Reeds have had to make to kind of reach their full potential by being on the council is to give up their friends and family, right? Is that that's the choice. You either you have to give these all up for the greater good.
Yeah.
Susan, his children, his friends, they'll all have to be given up if he wants to be a member of the council.
Yeah, he says the work will consume you. How can we think about little things like our personal lives when the fate of all we know lies in the balance? Susan will stop understanding, her patience will run out, and she's forced to raise the family all alone. Doesn't she deserve better? Ben and Johnny will get angry and eventually move on. Your children will resent you because you work too much and love too little. All you'll have left is this. He says, I'd never do that. He says, yes, you would, you will. It's the price, Reed. It always gets paid. Even knowing this is how it ends for me, I would gladly do it again. And then there's another flashback to when Reed's father is leaving. He says, I want you to stay. His father says, there are things that have to be done, things I must do. I don't have any other choice, son. I wish I did. How long will you be gone for? A long time, too long. If you truly need me, I'll be around, I promise. But what if I just want to talk? Reed, I've given you plenty of advice over the years, and I know you've listened because I see what you've become. The world is ugly. Oh, sorry, a man capable of making his own decisions. But the world is ugly. It should not be, but it is. It will force you to do things you know you should not do, to compromise, simply because you feel like you have no other choice. This weakens us. It makes men less than what we should be, and it will be even more difficult for you because you have an extra burden. And then he sort of points to his head and says, but this, points to his heart, without this means nothing. It is a terrible thing for someone not to reach their full potential, I know. As I've grown older, I've realized that I do not have the character to be both good and great at the same time. But you do, Reed. And as such, all of my hopes and desires rest in you becoming what I am not. When you grow up, I expect more. Son, I expect better. I want you to be a better friend than I was. And it jumps to a shot of him with Johnny and Ben. Be a better husband. Shows him and Sue. Be a better father, and shows the kids jumping on him. And the issue just closes with this great shot. It says, Reed, be a better man. And he's opened the door, and Sue has been crying outside of the door and turns toward him. I just think that's a great shot. Great sort of closing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think overall that it is something. I think it's a good message. I think it's something that is interesting. And you're right. I mean, you talked about this at the beginning about how we don't really have the kind of the categories for this very, very much anymore. It is about either like just kind of utilitarian or self-fulfillment, right? And that's not the choice that Reed makes here. He chooses, I think, the language I tend to think of it is vocation, right? That we're given, and that's I don't know if that's unique to kind of my Lutheran background or not, but is that vocation is really, we've been given these things, and the vocation of father, husband, all these things is how it's something that's given to us for us to kind of bless and love our neighbor through, these various vocations and serve our neighbor, right? Yeah. So it's not it is fulfilling, and it is ultimately for our own fulfillment of who we should be, but it's expressed through how we serve others. And there is even a sense of the humility. It's not, it seems silly to try to, if I could save billions of people in multiverses, I don't know if that's a choice. This is that it's more important to serve those people that are close to you, that you've been given, that are unique to you, than to be living up to what you feel like is your fullest potential. And I think that's a good message, and somewhat unique for, kind of modern society.
And I think also, I don't want to get sort of into spoilers here. If you don't want the sort of Secret Wars comic spoiled for you, skip the next minute. All right, I think they're all gone. But ultimately, it is only because Reed dedicates himself so much to his family that the multiverse is able to be saved at the end of Secret Wars, and that sort of everything can be recreated. It's because he has sort of so loved Franklin and sort of helped him to become sort of right. He didn't necessarily sort of like give him his powers, but he cultivated him in such a way that he's ultimately able to kind of recreate the multiverse and give it back to um I was gonna say all humanity, but all I don't know.
All multi-humanity.
Yeah, if you want to call it.
Humanities.
And I think that's really striking, right? That like in a sense, the vision of the Council of Reeds was like too small, and that like his father actually was right, that he wasn't necessarily right in saying that he himself couldn't be better than he was, but he was right in saying that Reed could sort of be both good and great, and through his goodness, the great things could actually happen. And I think that's really powerful, because it can be, I think, sometimes very. I mean, it's hard to be a father. It's hard to be a
Right.
person, but it's I think hard to be a father and a husband, who has all these senses of sort of responsibility, and also gifts that like you feel could be used in different ways, right? Like
Right.
it's like I love my kids to death, but like when I'm reading my 1-year-old Snuggle Puppy by Sandra Boynton for this time in like 10 minutes,
Yeah.
like there are other things I could be doing,
Right. Right.
right, but like that time really matters,
Mm-hmm.
and that time matters more than a lot of other things that I could be doing.
Yeah, and this is you're right, and I think this is, I don't know if men struggle with this particularly. Probably not. Probably it's not unique to men, but or fathers. But you see this where and it can be expressed sometimes in simple stuff like the midlife crisis, right? The, oh gosh, I should have been something greater than I was. And I think we all have this, especially when we're young, this sense that like we have this huge potential that needs, we could be great men of history, because I mean that's how kind of who we look to. And yet the usually what we're called to is to be a great man for one or two people, really, and that, or maybe 10 people at most, who knows, I mean, but
Yeah,
you can be a great man to your wife, you can be a great father to your children, and you can be one of the most important people in their life, far beyond, name your historical figure necessarily, aside maybe from some saints in Christ, but it's something that, like, I think for me, that is a, very, when we think about our own fathers, right, and the impact they had for good or for ill on our lives, right, you realize that, yeah, like that person was like the greatest man I ever encountered for good and for ill, and then it's our responsibility to take that for our own children, and to take that burden on, and to try to achieve goodness and greatness for them, as opposed for, some generic group that of the world, or recognition somewhere beyond that.
yeah. The
Yeah.
movie I'd recommend to her. Have you seen A Hidden Life?
No, but I want to. It's been
It's
it's
so
on
good.
my watch list. I do like Terrence Malick films, so
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's this. For those who don't know, it's this. So there's this director called Terrence Malick, who's one of my favorite directors, and he's like sort of very weird in very good ways. But he has this film, A Hidden Life, about Blessed Franz. What's his last name? It's something like Jägerstatter or something. I forget. But he was an Austrian who refused to sign the like oath of supremacy for Hitler and the Nazi Party, and was ultimately put to death, martyred for it. And the film is just beautiful, and most of it is just like him like working at his farm, and as the pressure is mounting. Yeah, highly recommended. 5 stars.
Yeah.
I cried like 6 times watching that movie in a theater. It is such a beautiful movie. But yeah. Anyway, so I think I won't try to say any more because what you just said was great. And we're reaching
at
time here.
Yeah.
For like content, so I'll speak here. Usually it's you, but I'll speak here because I've read the whole thing. It can be kind of violent at times, and it can, I think, just sort of be grappling with things that are a bit higher level. So I'd say like a 16-year-old or so.
Yeah, it seems about right.
And I'll also say, so I highly recommend this run with a couple of caveats. One is that the reading order becomes a headache. The best way is to just buy the 4 like big paperback complete collections, and just read those because they're all in order. Because halfway through, it gets rebranded to F, Future Foundation, and then a few volumes from that, then Fantastic Four is reintroduced, and they're running concurrently, and you need to read both. It's just very annoying if you do the trade paperbacks. But if you do the complete collection, it's all just in order. Or the omnibuses, but those are super expensive and like only for like real comic collectors. You have to like open them the right way the first time and stretch the binding properly, or else you'll break them, all this sort of thing. So just get the complete collections if you can, if you want to read them. Also, the first 3 complete collections are a series of different stories, but all really tightly interconnected and reach a really great natural crescendo. And then there's the 4th complete collection, which is mostly just random stories of like Reed's in Wakanda with Black Panther today and stuff. And then the last like couple of issues have some closing stuff. Like there's some closing stuff with the wizard and his sort of clone son, who's been taken as a kind of son to Reed over the course of it and this sort of thing. So maybe just like buy the first 3 complete collections and then just like skim the 4th one in the store and then read the last 3 issues in it. But I do recommend it. I think it does show some of the best of what contemporary superhero comics can do. And I wish more comics told stories like this while also like avoiding some of the failings it falls into of being like at times overly bogged down by continuity that nobody cares about, except for, I mean, I say this as like something of a comic nerd, but like total comic geeks who spend all of their time and money figuring out like intricate details of this. So like there's some stuff with the Inhumans that can just be kind of skimmed that doesn't matter. But the sort of core of the story is really beautiful. And does continue on into Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, and then ultimately crescendos in Secret Wars, which is a super like multiversal story that has lots of philosophical problems because of that, but also is just really fun and has at its heart the story of Reed, Susan, Doctor Doom, and Franklin and Valeria, and it's just beautiful. Yeah, so I would recommend it there. But I'm a Marvel guy, so maybe my recommendation is too easily won.
Yeah, I'd say for me, this was the best of what we read. What I've read out of this, I think it's there wouldn't be enough here that I've read so far to hook me in. Didn't hate it, obviously, but I think the problems that I run into is just the amount of continuity that I'm unfamiliar with. Not knowing if these are new elements that I'm supposed to be paying attention to, or are these referring to other things that I, need to go read something else. It is tough to jump into. Even though there's some good bits there. So.
Yeah, one tip I'll give to anyone who wants to get into Marvel Comics is to read a few issues and then watch the corresponding videos from Comics Explained on YouTube, where this guy who's just like, "Hey guys, today we're talking about Hickman's Fantastic Four. Oh gosh, I love this, blah, blah, blah. So this guy comes in and he's like, no, I'm not going to do this. And you see this guy was introduced back in this event, which was really cool when blah, 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 blah. And he's very excited about the whole thing. And says and on, takes too long to say things, so I normally listen to it on like 1.5 speed, but helps contextualize lore stuff and the continuity stuff. So I recommend that for going through Marvel stuff, because I tend to do that the first time I'm reading a series like this. And then afterwards, when I reread, I just reread, and I sort of know what's important and have forgotten the stuff that isn't.
That sound helpful.
Yeah. So next week we'll be turning to I'll just record one for Prince Valiant and one for Bone. Okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, I don't know how much Bone we'd want to read if we're doing Bone, like first 3 issues.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah,
That's, I think, like 90 pages.
Right. Yeah, that'd be good.
Next episode, we'll be turning to my favorite graphic novel of all time, Bone by Jeff Smith. We'll be reading the first 3 issues. If you don't own Bone, if you haven't read Bone before, my recommendation is just get it in black and white. Don't get the color reprints, because they're just so much worse. And I'm sure we'll talk about that briefly, but the black and white is just beautiful and wonderful. And just buy the all-in-one black and white edition for like $40. You will never regret it. If you enjoyed this episode of Truth Beauty Comics, there are 3 things you can do for the podcast to support it. The first is to keep listening and tell your friends about it.
The second is to review the podcast, giving it 5 stars wherever you listen to us.
The last thing you can do is consider contributing to our Patreon with a monthly donation. For as little as $3 a month, you can get perks like access to exclusive episodes, voting on upcoming episode topics, and even an original drawing from Levi. Most of all, you can help make this podcast sustainable. And also, if you ever have any comments about the podcast, reach out. We'd like to hear from you, and if you say something interesting, we'll read it on the podcast.
Absolutely. Well, that's the end of the episode. You can reach us at truthbeautycomics@gmail.com or on our social media accounts. Thanks for listening, and remember to take comics seriously and have fun while doing it.